Hello. So today I'm going to be talking about the 20th chapter of Indian politics and political processes. And this chapter looks more into the ethno-nationalist mobilization and how it fuels the separatism in Northeast India especially. Again, for context about this chapter, check out my website, but I'm going to go right into my analysis. Let's begin first with geography as a lens through which separatism becomes fueled by. So what strikes me most is the fact that when looking at a map of India's northeast, these regions are not incredibly vast in distance, but the different reactions and actions from the range of peace building to violence shows that it makes it seem that this is a region that varies quite greatly, especially given a long history of being quite close together. What we can see from the Northeast's ethno-nationalist movements is how geography as well as topography has made separatism and exclusionary sentiment from the central state like India become more fueled by something like the country of Bangladesh between the two, a very small corridor of land from central India to the northeast, and the maritime difficulties from getting across. So when we look at a comparison of another separatist movement, such as Catalonia and Scotland, these are quite accessible regions to their central governments, Spain and the UK respectively. But the geography of India from its northeast also plays a major role in the domestic politics, where the people feel physically distant from their leaders in Delhi and even physically distant from their leaders in their own capitals, in Assam or Manipur. That on its own makes integration harder. When land access is limited, maritime access is limited, and it's no easy feat to really bring that part of the country together with the rest of central India. I call central India the part that is not in the northeast in this context. Although the states of Manipur and Nagaland are recognized as states, the people of the areas can probably relate more to the people of New Caledonia with France or Hawaii with the United States. I use these two as a range to show that there are two different forms of separatism, the light separatism and cultural autonomy that is more prevalent in Hawaii against the United States versus the political autonomy that has become violent at times from New Caledonia against France. It's a fascinating dilemma where separatism feels more feasible because of the established distance between, in this case, Delhi and states like Assam. And it comes to show that geography and distance does matter. Even if you do give a region statehood or give multiple states, there is technically a land access also between the area, but this is even limited in itself. And this in itself essentially makes it that they almost feel like a colony away from India, from the main parts that Delhi is mainly looking for influence from. This then becomes similar to a territorial control from a central state, where the state is almost out of touch with the concerns of the Northeast, at least compared to the ones in the central and more easier accessible parts of India. But again, this isn't to compare it to New Caledonia or the Hawaiian context entirely concerning their colonial ties, but the Northeast Indian situation falls between this range of exclusionary sentiment that is truly valid, as well as the political incorporation that has been attempted with the given statehood and the whole rights of being the state, a part of India. I had to change the lighting real quick, but whatever. So secondly, we have to take into consideration the historical background and the historical empathy that we should apply to this situation. It's worth noting that the calls for autonomy preceded the Indian state's independence, and that we cannot entirely blame India for its inheritance of this problem. The British both worsened and appeased this problem, although that is not to say that worsen and appeasing can't really happen at the same time, but the British's policies of establishing the Assam state and eventually undermining these people's rights when India became independent and incorporated that into India is one example of this whole issue. When discussing the issue of separatism and crushing the autonomous rights of the people in the Northeast here, we need to acknowledge that this is a problem that might on the surface have a clear solution, which is just giving them independence, but it is its roots is a problem that will dwindle down to a more lower and local level that doesn't in itself have an easy solution. We can already see that with the Kuki and Naga nationalists who come at odds over where their proposed states should be, since they both lay claim to each other's expected borders. The issue of autonomy proposes the question of whose autonomy. Is it the people, the Mizo National Front's idea of autonomy, which is them in charge of it, or is it the Mizo people, which is a more general term and doesn't exactly have one answer for them all? The MNF, which is the Mizo National Front, tries to legitimize itself as the rightful leaders of the Mizos, but that situation itself already has demonstrated its own internal conflict between the Lushe and the Hamar people. Separatism can be theoretically broken down further and further, as we can go down to even the individual household, and even further down into just the individuals, which goes more into the general psychology, which, as much as I like to get into, gets a little off track here. But it shows that it can go that broken down that eventually we can't exactly say that one person will be in charge or has the rightful authority to be in charge. But what I'm trying to get from this is that even though we can break this down into so many more smaller levels, the reverse can also be applied and realized, as the reverse shows that this can also be a necessary background for us to understand the Indian state context. Now, India itself was a British colony, as we can remember. So it was itself a separatist movement. That, of course, succeeded. That's how the state became a thing. But success is too open of a term to define what it means for people like in the Northeast tribal people, because they didn't fully support joining the Indian state that the same way that the mainstream Hindu part of India did want to. Additionally, what separatist movements want is to act like their own leaders, which is basically they want to act like the India for their own people. And yes, I'm sure that these leaders acknowledge that, yes, when it comes to power, someone has to take control, and they probably think that they will do a better job because they are more localized and more understanding of their people and their power structure, which doesn't mean that they have to be wrong, which are both simultaneously true in a way. But because by leading your people, you are also making decisions for the whole collective. And of course, no two humans are fully in agreement, which leaves the door open to dissent and potentially more separatism. So let's look at this from the perspective of the oppressors, in this case, the state of India. Many might perceive India as simply neglecting the northeastern populations because they value their own concerns, which is development, national development, industrializations for the whole nation in itself, which in a way can be selfish, but in a way is a truly valid concern. They're trying to uplift the whole country. But we should recognize, isn't this exactly what is likely to happen, at least? What is likely to happen to the Kuki and Naga nationalists if they get control of their own state? Because isn't the role of the central Manipur or Nagaland authority must come before, if this state becomes its own country, Nagaland, Manipur, is not the concerns of the central Nagaland government supposed to come before the interests of individuals at certain times, at least, for the sake of uniting the whole country? Well, this is exactly what the Indian state has been trying to do. They have been trying to do this since independence, to mend these distinctions. So between the Indian state and those in the states who do not feel like they are a part of their country, which includes the tribes in the Northeast. Now, I don't have an answer to whether these separatist actions should be respected or ignored, but what I do want to provide is just intellectual humility into the fact that separatism is both a valid concern in the same way that India was pushing for its own separate country in the 1940s, as valid as the Northeast has been pushing for up to today. Finally, I want to touch on immigration, which doesn't exactly have a connection to the separatism aspect of this chapter, but more into the nationalist mobilization against the Indian state via more of a proxy issue, which is immigrants coming into the region. Additionally, immigration has an interesting dimension here, as opposed to what I, at least, am more familiar with in the West. As was seen in the examples with Assam and Manipur, immigrants from Bangladesh and even from central India have been perceived as encroachers on the tribal lives of the neighboring Indian states. The Indian example provides a new perspective towards anti-immigration sentiments, as the use of armed resistance is more quickly turned to than the anti-immigrant rhetoric from the United States or even the indigenous people's response to the current American form of immigration. India's northeastern immigration issue is more similar to the context in late 19th century American expansion in the West into native people's lands, where it is not an issue that the Indian cultural fabric is being attacked in the perspective of those from the central subcontinent of India, but it is more that the developmental efforts of incorporating Muslims and Hindus into the Northeast is instead intruding on the livelihoods of the tribal people already living there. So India is trying to incorporate an industrialized model onto the Northeast, and regions like Tripura, where Muslims outnumber the tribal people, is definitely seeing a lot of resistance to this change. That although the Indian state isn't exactly pushing for, it is instead pushing for violence between the two to stop. And this in itself demonstrates more of the Indian state's will for industrialization efforts to happen rather than to necessarily remove the immigrants. So in this way, immigration is almost used as a tool of cultural power by the Indian state. Maybe not necessarily, but in a proxy way, that they are letting it happen for the sake of the Indian state. So this is similar to the Hawaiian context, where India is trying to ingrain industrialization efforts in the region so that the region becomes a little more dependent on the state. Now, although it's not explicitly being done, as I said, it is mainly from the diplomatic efforts to pacify the tensions that between the tribal peoples, and to essentially accept the coming changes to the states envisioned changes that the central Indian state wants to see in the region. And the BJP's ability to maneuver the politics of this region shows that there is possibility to see success in these efforts. It's already hatching in some ways, it's pretty early on, but it's a more recently developing phenomenon that should be followed in the coming years to understand both the tribal people's rights and the growth of the Indian state under the BJP especially. So I don't have too much to bring to this chapter besides those 3 points, but I'll just wrap it up. The chapter provided me more of a profound understanding of geography and distance as factors of separatism that in some ways continue to exist today. And it's also an excellent example about the historical empathy between relationships between northeastern separatism against India and the inter-conflict between the separatist groups, as well as the historical external argument that we could talk about between British India and the now free India, and about the methods of soft power via immigration that are exercised in the Northeast, even without written laws showing where the Indian state's priorities lie. This topic provides a history echoes theme where these recurring themes of state priorities coming at odds with ethnonationalism can be traced back to before our time and continue to affect the politics of India today.